Hello and welcome. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Luis Jaramillo, the Associate Chair of the Writing Program. And thanks again for coming to tonight's celebration of Michael Batterberry's life and work. As most of you know, Michael Batterberry was a legendary food writer who founded Food and Wine and then Food Arts magazines with his wife, Ariane, who is with us tonight, along with Brad Farmerie, Katy Keiffer, Katy Keiffer, Michelle Nischan, and Beverly Stephen. The Culinary Luminaries series is produced by the Food Studies program at the New School. Past honorees have included MFK Fisher, Julia Child, James Beard, and Pellegrino Artusi. And if you'd like to be put on the Food Studies mailing list to receive information about events like these, please sign up in the table in the back. In addition to the rest of the growing curriculum of Food Studies courses, for the spring, the Food Studies and Writing program are teaming up on Food Narratives, a course which will explore the diverse world of food writing. In the new year, please also look for the launch of our website devoted to academic and creative writing about food. The site will publish work by students and professionals and will welcome contributions from the community. I'd like to thank Pam Tillis, Fabio Parasecoli, Lori Lynn Turner, Ahmet Sibdil Sao for his help organizing the event, Abby Lewis, and of course Beverly Stephen, who will be our moderator for the evening. Beverly Stephen has worked as a writer, editor, and columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and New York Daily News, where she wrote about women's issues, contemporary culture, lifestyles, food, fashion, and travel. At the Daily News, she covered a groundbreaking culinary event showcasing American chefs that Michael and Ariane Batterberry staged to celebrate the first anniversary of Food and Wine magazine. At the time, neither suspected they would devote the next decades to promoting the American chefs at another Batterberry publication called Food Arts, which Beverly joined in 1990 as a senior editor and writer. She has been executive editor of Food Arts since 1999. Please give a warm welcome to Beverly Stephen.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. I see a number of old friends out in the audience who did know Michael, and I know there are other people here who didn't. So part of why we're going to show some pictures and videos is to acquaint everyone with him a little bit more. As Luis said, he was one of America's most influential writers on food and restaurants and founded both Food Arts and Food and Wine magazines. Maybe people don't know, but he was a true Renaissance man. He led a very picaresque life before beginning his career in food journalism. At one point, he was a cabaret singer in Rome, a sketch artist for the Paris Review, and worked on numerous Italian films. He also lived in France and Venezuela, where he built floats for Carnival and designed an Alfa Romeo showroom. So he knew a lot of things, which figured into our whole thing here. So singly or with Ariane, he wrote 18 books on food, art, and social history. They're on The Town in New York, which they actually wrote together before they were married, was long the standard history of dining in the city, and they updated it in 1999. As the New York Times succinctly summarized in Michael's obituary, he was both a chronicler and a shaper of late 20th century food culture. His interest lay not merely in food per se, but in food as a mirror of the collective psyche. In May of 2010, the Batterberrys received the James Beard Lifetime Achievement Award, and we're going to share a few minutes of the video that they showed at the award presentation. It shows, I think will acquaint you with Michael's history, and he even has a little film clip with James Beard. So we just...
Michael and Ariane Batterberry have been immeasurably influential on the culinary world.
Michael and Ariane are as influential as James Beard ever was, and even Julia Child.
He's known as the father of American cuisine today, American cooking, as we prefer to call it.
Well, can we quote Julia?
Let's quote Julia Child.
Who said, in the beginning there was Beard.
The person who we must single out as our great mentor and who invited us into the food establishment, which at that time was a tiny little world compared to the universe that it's become, was James Beard.
Michael and Ariane, their legacy will be as the Renaissance couple. If you knew their early lives, it had a lot to do with art. And if you look at the body of work they've done, their 18 books, really one of the greatest books on the history of eating in New York.
Ariane and Michael Batterberry, they're historians, and they themselves created history in the food world.
When we founded Food and Wine, Michael and I realized that suddenly there was a great interest on the part of men in food, and that it was definitely time for a publication for the new interest in food, which was for both men and women.
Food and Wine magazine was on the cusp of the American food revolution.
Food and Wine actually helped the public at large take the food world as a serious form of cultural expression.
What I loved about food arts is the Batterberries are always the people that are one step ahead of every trend.
There were still people out there who didn't understand that this whole industry existed.
Prior to food arts, chefs were blue-collar workers. It was a revolution that was happening in France, in Europe, and here. People started to look at chefs in new light. And this magazine put them in gorgeous color and really told the true professional story.
We've also been extremely lucky, and we're grateful for it because we were welcomed into the community as a crew. This is like an extended family operation, writing about people we know and admire, and there's always something new going on. Who knows what the future is going to hold?
Michael and Ariane will leave a food world that is better for them having been in it, and if they weren't, it would be completely different than it is now.
We could not have done any of this without each other.
It's absolutely true, absolutely true.
We all love this video. It's fabulous. And it's actually up on our website, and there's actually more to it from the presentation of their award and everything, if anybody wants to look at more of it. We also brought along a few slides to show on a PowerPoint, just a few stories and covers that we think illustrate Michael's history. The first one's just a photo of them at the Beard Awards. And then we just have a selection of photos of Michael at various food arts events. This is the cover of the memorial issue we produced for Michael last December. He really wasn't the type of person that you would commission a corporate-style oil painting of. So we commissioned an Israeli food artist named Nir Adar, whose career Michael actually launched about 20 years ago, to create a conceptual sculpture. We wanted to capture Michael as a Renaissance man with numerous interests, talents, and knowledge going out in all directions, and I think he did a terrific job of that. Our tribute noted that all of Michael's friends and colleagues called him the Bat, so henceforth we may just refer to him as the Bat. There was a beautiful, meaningful memorial service that our owner and publisher Marvin Shankin hosted at the Pierre, and Culinary Luminaries from all over the country came to pay tribute to Michael. Together, they all painted a portrait of a man who was refined but not snobbish, erudite without being patronizing, stylish but also substantive and sincere, charismatic but also whimsical. And then we asked 5 of the chefs who he was closest to create a fantasy meal, which we photographed, but no one ever ate this, in his honor. They were Dan Barber, Daniel Ballou, Michael Chiarello, Frank DiCarlo, and Francois Payard. And this is a selection of Michael's favorite colors. He was really quite a genius at combining food and art. And just a couple of them, you'll see down in the third row, the man with the cocktail shaker and all the people shaking cocktails. That was in like 2001, before there were cocktails on every corner. The fake kidnapping scene is Elizabeth Blau, who basically gathered up all the famous chefs in Las Vegas to work at the Bellagio, and ever since people have been getting celebrity chefs at hotels. The June 2008 cover, Food Faces Changed, which is the one with the clouds on the bottom row, was in 2008. And that really predicted how much change we were going to be facing with all the issues of sustainability and rising food costs. Our former executive editor, Julie Mountainer, wrote a touching and humorous memoir about her first meeting with the Bats and the early days of food arts. I just want to quote like a paragraph from her article. Thanks to Michael, the vibe at Food Arts was often more salon than office. Rarely a day would go by without a visit from someone, a food writer looking for work, a young chef seeking a stage, a reporter sniffing for trends, or an author plugging a book. Anyone who found their way to Michael was guaranteed an ear, a helping hand, a leg up. In fact, Anthony Bourdain wrote on his blog after Michael passed away that Michael was one of the first people anywhere to treat me like a writer, back when I was an anonymous line-cooking journeyman chef, long before Cooking Confidential. As Julie wrote, Michael was a catalyst, a connector, a networker in the very best sense. Today, there's a huge, far-flung, disparate band of us out there, orbiting around the wonderful world created by the Bats. And we've gathered some of those believers here today to tell you about their experiences and how Michael changed their life, both in the worlds of writing and as a chef and in the world of activism. Ariane, his wife and partner in crime for decades, is going to speak first and read from a wonderful piece he wrote. Nischan is going to talk about the chef activist role, Katy Keiffer as a journalist, and Brad Farmerie as a chef. So Ariane will go first and tell us about the early days.
Yes. I thought I would start by telling you about really Michael's roots because, well, he was born in England but of American parents. He lived in the States most of his growing years. He came here in 1939 when the family had to leave England for obvious reasons. And but for him, the seminal period of his life were the years he spent in Rome. I should explain that he was just about to graduate from Carnegie Tech when his family moved to Latin America, to Venezuela, and he went with them. And 2 years later, rather than coming back and finishing college, he moved to Rome. And his dream was, at that point, he was a painter because he had so many different talents. But the thing was, his time in Rome was a magical time, just an enchantment, and it was the basis of everything he did later. For one thing, it was the time of La Dolce Vita. It was the late 50s. And in fact, he had a group of roommates, sort of as young kids did in those days, and one of his roommates was a young man named Francesco Guidini, and Francesco was trying to make his living as a journalist, and he went to a lot of parties at night, and he was looking for something to write, so he wrote about what he did, and the papers published it, and everybody knew Federico Fellini, including Michael and his roommate, and Fellini based his picture, La Dolce Vita, on the life of Michael's roommate, who would go out to parties in different places and then report on socially what people were doing. So Michael was right at the very heart of La Dolce Vita. And it was a magical time because it was a time when he learned all about food, all about cooking, really in Italy. The reason he learned so much was in those days he and his friends could afford to have a maid come in once or twice a week. And the maids were young girls who came from, or young women who came from all over Italy. And each one, they discovered, had a great dish that she made. So Michael learned all the dishes that the maids were able to cook when they would come. And as there was a constant change in maids, he was constantly learning new dishes. And he was the one who, for his group of friends, would do all the cooking. And he also was invited one night by Bricktop, you know, the wonderful Black American woman who had the great in nightclub in Rome. It had been the great nightclub in Paris. Then she moved to Rome, and she invited Michael to sing one evening. And he was such a success that she invited him to stay for the year. So he was singing every night at Bricktops and painting every day. And then he earned most of his living by dubbing films at Cinecittà, and they were always dubbed into English. Rather than having the English printed below, they were dubbed. And he dubbed with people like Marlene Dietrich and so on. So he was having a wonderful time. And he also drew. You see, he wasn't writing then, but he drew for the Paris Review, which was the great publication then for bright, intellectual young Americans living in Europe. And they had a great writers series, and Michael was invited to draw Isaac Dinesen, who was, as you know, Baroness Blixen. And he not only drew her, but years later he wrote this wonderful account of meeting her and having lunch with her. And I'll just read parts of it because it'll give you an idea of the kind of magical world in which he was living then, and his great interest in food, which just grew and grew. I should say when he was in Rome, he never wrote anything, but he wrote brilliantly about his time in Rome years later. Michael, by the way, was a natural writer. He didn't study writing, but he was a voracious reader. And I think very often people who are voracious readers become natural writers. Anyway, this is his description of first meeting the Baroness. I stood at courtier attention, trying to look gifted. At last the elevator door slid open, and out scuttled a frail figure chicly swathed in camel's hair, trailing a floating Grand Tour scarf, and a breathless lady in waiting. A tobacco-brown clush was pulled down over her nose to make a cave for her eyes. Huge, coal-rimmed, falcon-wide, they seemed to move ahead of everything else, taking charge, leading the way. Then he describes going with Baroness Blixen and her friend to a restaurant on the Via Appia. Our destination was a restaurant built upon haunted stones of an ancient cistern across from a maze of catacombs on the Appian Way, up which the Roman legions had marched in glory. Then he describes sitting in the restaurant, and they've all ordered a pasta then. But Baroness Blixen insisted on ordering something called pollo alla Nerone, please. That was chicken in the style of Nero. Once the pasta plates disappeared, the sound of marching feet rang on. It was the waiters reappearing like the woods advancing on Dunsinane. At least 3 of them hoisted great bushy boughs of green laurel with raw thorn ends. Another 2 brandished dripping golden blistered chickens on long sturdy forks. The rear was brought up by yet another, this one porting a brandy bottle. Like centurions crossing lances, those armed with the branches of bay leaves stood back and extended their boughs until they slightly overlapped. The brandy bearer uncapped the bottle and drenched the leaves. The others held the speared chicken aloft, directly over the shining wet laurel. A match was struck and the branches exploded in a thunderous roar. The roses nearby vanished in clouds of pungently perfumed smoke. The waiters manfully held their stances, teeth bared and eyes squinting. The flames failed slowly. I watched their dying reflection flicker and glint into enormous falcon-wide eyes. They say that the Oracle of Delphi chewed laurel leaves to work herself into a visionary trance, seated in a cloud of steam that rose from a secret chamber below. As I watched the Baroness's eyes through drifts of laurel smoke, I thought of the Oracle. Anyway, that's an idea of the sort of wonderful time, magical time, as I said, Michael had in Rome. Shortly after he left Rome, he returned to New York, That was when I met him, and we became friends. We started to go out, and we had the idea of writing a history of restaurants worldwide, and we were going to write it with Hugh Johnson, who was a close friend. But we realized very soon that just a history of restaurants in New York would be quite enough. And in those days, it was not easy to work with somebody living in England. In the days when you had to, the closest you could come was to send an airmail letter. So that was when we wrote our history of dining in New York. And it was some years after that that we were approached to start Food and Wine. So I think I've used up my 10 minutes.
I think that's fabulous. I love
you.
that story. That is one of the best stories Michael ever wrote.
Yes,
He's
it was
written
one of
many,
his-
but I think both because of the magical time and because he did such a wonderful job describing what happened, describing how she looked and describing the food. I mean, you feel like you're there in this. Talk about flair and flambe in a restaurant. That is really dangerous.
The ultimate.
But Michael also pioneered efforts to unite chefs, restaurateurs, and farmers in a mutual nationwide support system that also serves to advance the cause of sustainable agriculture. And Nischan, who's the founder and president of Wholesome Wave, is one of those chefs for whom Michael served as a catalyst. And he's going to tell you his history with Michael and what it's resulted in, which is quite wonderful.
Thanks. Well, first, I think it's important to note that really understanding where Michael came from is important because he and a very, very small group of very influential people to American food culture could go to a place like Italy during a time like this and then come back to America and say, oh my goodness, something has gone terribly awry here and something is missing. And not only do we need to write about this to see what we can do to stop the cultural bleeding that was happening on the American culinary scene at that time. I mean, we're talking about a time when a gourmet meal was a steak the size of your torso and a baked potato the size of your head. But not just write about it and tell people about it and try to tell stories like this and get people interested in food culture, but understanding the recipe of ingredients that need to be put together to make that cultural movement real and whole. And that's one thing that Michael really understood that was really remarkable, and I think the beauty of both you, Ariane, and Michael together is that there was no stone that was unturned in that effort. Michael had this penchant for really recognizing what was going to be next and what should be next, but not only what should be next, what might this person who has this, interesting idea, great vision, a particular talent, whatever it might be, what are they missing to make that something really great? They might be missing knowledge, they might be missing information, they might be missing a relationship with somebody that would be perfect to help them along their way. Just this uncanny ability between the two of you to identify those missing things and then proffer a notion in the most interesting way. So it was like an understanding of recipe on a human scale, different types of ingredients. When Michael and I met, my wife Lori and I owned a restaurant in Connecticut back in the early 90s that was buying from farmers. And I had already been doing that for quite some time. And he really loved the restaurant, and we became friends, Michael, Ariane, I, Lori, and stayed in touch with each other as time went on. And I couldn't help but notice that every time we all got together, we always came out of something that added a tremendous amount of value to our career. Fast forwarding about 10 years, I was at a restaurant called Heartbeat in New York City. And there was a perfect storm that was happening in my life. I was a chef. Our first son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Before that, I was really worried about local, organic, sustainable farm direct, but also, getting the 3 stars and getting my mark on the culinary scene. When Chris got sick and I started understanding the connection of food to human health, and that being in the white tablecloth industry, that less than 1% of white tablecloth restaurants if all of them, less than 1% of the industry was white tablecloth restaurants. If all white tablecloth restaurants tomorrow went farm to table, it would not even put a blip on the radar screen of changing the food system. And what was at stake when I learned about Chris's diabetes and what we needed to do to give him his best long-term outcome, we learned about type 2 diabetes, which is even more prevalent and mostly prevalent in seriously underserved communities where people can't make the choice for better food. I felt like quitting. And I felt like everything that I was doing as a farm-to-table chef and promoting it was worthless because the only people that could really take part in any part of my vision were people who could afford to spend $40 on an entree. So when I told Michael that I was thinking about quitting, he said, "Well, that just won't do." And he said, as he often does, "I have somebody that I think you should meet that feels exactly the same as you do. And the two of you should just get together." And he arranged a lunch for me with a man named Gus Schumacher, who at the time was the Undersecretary of Agriculture for Food and Foreign Services under the Clinton administration, which is the third highest post in USDA. In fact, we often joke that Gus was once, we introduce him as, Gus was once the next Secretary of Agriculture of the United States, because if Al Gore would have won the presidency, he would have been the secretary. Gus and I met, and we started sharing this vision that the true hope in changing our food system really meant that we had to get the broader general public involved, whether it was middle America, whether it was underserved communities. And Gus had already chosen seriously underserved communities. We just started this notion that, wow, if we could just figure out a way to get these immigrant, refugee cultures affordable access to locally grown foods, they could probably shift enough buying power to change the food system. We started that as a notion. We thought it might be a little bit crazy. Most of the top people in the food world told us it will never work. Top people in the policy world said, you guys, this is pie in the sky. The best you're going to get from foundations is a couple of years worth of funding, and you're not going to have any effect on policy change. All of the top experts told us that. Michael said, you should just found a damn organization. Would you two just get together and start it? So we founded Wholesome Wave in 2007, and a dream that if we doubled the value of federal food assistance like food stamps, WIC benefits, if people chose to spend their food assistance benefits at a farmer's market on locally grown fruits and vegetables, that we might make farmers markets viable in underserved communities. And we had a goal of 10 states in 5 years. In 2007, we started in 3 states. In about 8 markets. We thought we'd make 50 markets in 5 years. Today, less than 5 years after starting the program, we're in 30 states, 300 markets, and have already effected administrative and grant-level policy change in Washington. So all of the things that we were told would be impossible, getting people in underserved communities interested in eating fresh fruits and vegetables, let alone buying them from a local farmer, Michael just didn't believe any of it. He had this uncanny ability to look into the future and say, this is something that is worth doing. This is something that you cannot stop at. You will not, you should not stop at. And the minute you think you're going to stop, I'm going to introduce you to somebody who's going to convince you otherwise. And it was just remarkable. The journey with Michael and Ariane together through Wholesome Wave has been astonishing because it's really bucked just a lot of ideas. We have proven that there is demand in underserved communities, that educational outreach and lack of education has a lot less to do with the choices, food choices that people make in these communities, and the data that we've collected is actually changing the face of the way Americans are going to look at people on food assistance. So it's been really massive, and you know, for me, had I not met Michael and Ariane, I never would have been introduced to Gus. I probably would have been out of the culinary world 10 years ago and not looked back. So I know that this one small story is just one in 1,000 of the types of relationships that this famous couple has made completely unselfishly. They didn't do this because they thought it would give food arts a leg up. They didn't do it because it was going to sell more copy. It was 2 years before a story was even done in food arts about Wholesome Wave. It really was that they believed that for America to have the type of food culture that he encountered abroad, that everybody had to have a right and an ability to celebrate food with their family, no matter what their level of income was, that there was more to relationships than just finding a really great chef or a really great cook or a really great market, that it was relationships, and meaningful relationships, action, activity, passion, all of those good things, and he was a great supporter of that. So when I look at the thousands of people that he's introduced, and you're going to hear from some others, to say that our food world today and the food culture in the United States would look much, much different were it not for the efforts of this dynamic duo, I really believe that that's a truthful assessment. Thanks for your time.
I think that's a fabulous story. I mean, we really love the story of Gus and Michelle getting together and doing this, and the results are incredible. Every time I see one of you and you tell me you've got more states and more people, it's fabulous,
cool. Yeah,
and it is so much a legacy from Michael. It's great.
Yeah.
Michael was also very helpful to journalists, and Katy Keiffer is going to represent that aspect. She's worked in many aspects of the food industry, as a cook, a caterer, a butcher, and a teacher. Yeah, she's a butcher. And now she's a meat expert. So she met Michael, and she'll tell us how he encouraged her to write, and she's become an expert at writing about meat.
Yeah, I'm a certified meat geek now. Doesn't mean I bite the heads off of live chickens, but, pretty close. Yeah, I met Michael because I was doing public relations for Culinary books. I worked with a woman named Rosemary Morris, who was a lifelong friend of Michael and Ariane's. And one of the first projects that I worked on with Rosie was Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential. And we did so well with that book, and it sort of got us into a lot of places we would never have gone had it not been as successful as it was. And eventually, after about 5 or 7 years, Rosemary, who had been running this business by herself and running herself into the ground, decided it was time to take a rest. And I was kind of done with calling editors on the phone and begging them to review books that I knew they never would. So we, reluctantly shut up shop, and I was looking around for something else to do. And I had only met Michael, I'd only met you a couple of times, I think, at that point. But Rosie called Michael, and he invited me down for a little chit chat. And in the course of our conversation, he asked me, what I wanted to do and also what I had done before. And when I mentioned the butchering thing, his eyes kind of lit up. And then we ended up having this interesting conversation about the meat industry, about which at the time I knew nothing, except that I was interested in it. And I still to this day don't know why I'm so interested in it, but I am. Anyway, he gave me a few books to review. I did the reviews, and then he liked them well enough to assign me a story. And I think one of the first stories I did was on steaks. Aging steaks. So I got to meet a bunch of different guys in the meat industry and talk about how long they age steaks and what happens and all that kind of stuff. And the story went well. And then I got another story about doing heritage breeds and growing heritage breeds. And by that time, I was sort of like, wow, this is a really cool industry. I love this. And I kept reading, and I sort of signed up for these trade blogs, which I read to this day religiously, like Drover's Cattle Network and meetingplace.com. I mean, I am absolutely obsessed. No, yes. I go to USDA conferences, and I really have started paying attention to what was happening. And it was right at the beginning of when the public consciousness really started to grow about changing our food system. And it was amazing how Michael had already pegged the livestock industry as something that was going to be undergoing some very radical changes in the very near future. And of course, shortly after I began writing, a couple of years later, there was that massive beef recall with the company out in Chico, California. The Westlake Hallmark, I think, was the name of the company. They ended up going belly up. They had to recall millions of pounds of beef, which had gone into school lunch programs, and the whole place, the country went crazy about it. And it led to a lot of scrutiny of the industry. Then in the course of a conversation I'd had with Michael, right at the beginning, again, like when we were discussing the story, I mentioned to him that I had always wanted to do a radio program about the industry of food, that I was sick of hearing about chefs pardon me, fellas, but
No worries.
that I was
It's all
kind, I'm
good.
kind of done
Me
with
too.
that. It was right at the height of the sort of star chef thing, and everybody was, all goo-goo-eyed over, Anthony Bourdain and Eric Ripert, and I was kind of like, and much as I like and admire both of them, I just didn't want to talk about or hear about them anymore, but I really wanted to hear about the business of food. How does food travel? How does it get from one place to another? And why isn't it easier for farmers who live 40 miles away to get their product into New York than it is, for them to get it loaded onto a Cisco truck where it goes out to Chicago and then off to California and then back to New York? I mean, those systems started to interest me, and I said, I'd love to do a show just about the systems. And I said, would you want to do that with me, Michael? He said, well, no, not really. I mean, I think it's a great idea, though. And about 6 months later, Patrick Martins, who runs a wonderful meat distribution company called Heritage Foods USA, decided to open a radio station, which he really saw as a marketing opportunity for Heritage Foods. And he created this in the back of a restaurant called Roberta's in Bushwick, Brooklyn, out of 2 shipping containers. It cost about $3,000 to build the station, and then he borrowed a little more money from his company. And I was sent down by Michael to interview Patrick about the Heritage Radio Network. And I played phone tag with Patrick for so long that eventually he said, just come to the station and do the show, and then you could ask me questions. So I did, and we hit it off immediately, and the next thing I knew, I was co-hosting this show with him, which I did for 2.5 years. And I'm still doing radio there. We now have 29 shows on the network. We almost completely focus on food and beverage, although we have a few other. We have a couple of music shows. We have an architecture show, the only one in the United States, actually. And a few other sort of interesting little bits and pieces, an arty show called The Food Scene and stuff. But without Michael, like as Michelle said, those connections, he remembered that I had talked about radio, and a year and a half later, or whatever it was, suddenly he's saying, oh, Patrick is doing this. Well, let me send Katy there, and let me make this happen for her. And then all of the meat people that he hooked me up with ended up with me going to, on the dime of Certified Angus beef, which is a big commodity beef brand, I was taken out to one of the largest Cargill slaughtering and processing plants in the United States last year, and through a variety of circumstances, I ended up getting a special solo tour of this Cargill plant. I was the first journalist in 15 years allowed into this plant, and believe me, the meat industry is deeply opaque. I mean, nobody gets in there. They took me in, and my tour guide was Temple Grandin, the well-known autistic animal handler who has now become a good friend of mine. And I got taken through this thing. I saw the process of commodity beef from start to finish. I visited feedlots. And all of this was thanks to Michael, just remembering that I was a butcher, that I was interested in the business, and encouraging me to develop that along with the stories that I wrote, to really, read those blogs and get that information and become an expert on the subject. And I'm just endlessly grateful to him. And I think the legacy that I have about with the radio and with being a food writer now was something I never anticipated in my wildest dreams as I, slaved over my little catering company stove, I mean, I just never thought any of this would happen. And here I am at the new school talking about Michael Batterberry. But it was a great honor to know Michael. I certainly wish I had gotten to know him better. And I think I am only one of thousands, I mean, literally probably thousands of people whose lives were touched by him. And as Michelle said, he made those connections, and he made things happen in a way that was just so graceful and seamless. There was never any sense of awkwardness or like, oh, I don't really want to ask you for a favor or something. It was just like, yeah, here, go ahead. Here it is. Do it. Take it and run. And, I think none of us who knew Michael or worked with him or had those opportunities will ever forget or not be grateful to him and to Ariane for making all of this happen and for changing. I mean, I see it now in the radio station. I will shut up. But I see it now in the radio station, in the interests that people have, in the content that we bring in about farms and farmers and people who are cooking nose to tail, and cookbook authors who are working on that concept. And all of these things are just incredibly hip and groovy, but they're also really great. And it's really working, and especially with younger people who are so, becoming sort of like I'm a baby boomer. I marched against the Vietnam War. I marched against, the man, the establishment, all of that stuff. And this is the new generation's cause, is changing our food system and making it better for everybody. And I really see that as Michael's greatest legacy, I think, ultimately, is to have fostered that, that sense of change and forward thinking. Thanks, folks.
Well, you're such an important part of that. And Michael did meet a lot of people, but he did remember what people needed to do and who they needed to meet. And he always encouraged people to follow their dream. I mean, he would always talk to the young people who were the interns who worked for us or whatever, if they wanted to be a writer, whatever they wanted to do, he would say, follow your dream. And, I think that's really important because people need to be happy at what they're doing. The other thing, of course, that Michael was extremely interested in was the chef world. And he was always very interested in meeting the new young chefs, the up-and-coming chefs, to see what they were thinking, what they were cooking, what they were doing. And Brad Farmerie is one of those chefs. He helped to conceive the Michelin-starred Public in 2003 with the Avoco Group. And then he did Double Crown, which has since been transformed into Saxon and Parole. And he can tell you his experience with Michael and how he was encouraged by him.
Thank you. I think I came on to Michael Batterberry quite late, is what my mother-in-law tells me. I met him in 2005. Rosemary Morse had known the Batterberries since, I think, the 50s or 60s, as she's kind enough to tell me. She told me that they used to run in a great group. Everyone was very well educated, very well traveled, and had a lot to say. And the first time I met the Batterberries, that was exactly what I saw. She brought them in for dinner at Public in about 2005, and I was walking out to the table. I was very, very nervous. I'd been living in London, had been reading food arts for a long time. And so to finally get to meet these people was something very special. And so I saw them before anything, and they were a very well-dressed group and made quite an impression. And then I heard Michael long before I got to meet him because he had that quite amazing voice. I don't know if it was a baritone or what it was, but it just rang out through the restaurant, kind of announcing that he was there. And then I got to shake hands, got to cook a meal for them. And then the most amazing thing, they kind of gave me their seal of approval on the spot, and I was chuffed. I was very excited. But I think more importantly, a couple days later, Michael gave me a call. And so, Michael Batterberry's on the phone. So rushed off to my office, shut the door, turned the music off. I was like, okay. Picked it up, and so of course I assumed it was about some big breaking story that I was going to be right on the front of. And we spoke for maybe half an hour, and it was about every subject under the sun. It was amazing. It was about politics, it was about art and my upbringing, and at the end of it, his real message came across, and he said, your food's very good. He said, which I was like, oh God, sweat the brow. And he said, your food's very good. You need to get your message out because I think right now you have a great restaurant, but you're not getting your message out. And so he said, that might be through TV, that might be through press, that might be through written word, but you have a very unique message and you need to get that message out. So, of course, I thanked him, and I was still quaking in my boots, went out into the kitchen, revived, ready to go. I think over the years, I would get interesting mystery calls from Michael Batterberry every once in a while. And it was never about a story. It was always about, what's taking the temperature of the industry, talking to young people, getting my voice about what was happening in the industry, and then letting me know what he had been speaking to other people about as well. And, of course, I took this as an amazing, amazing thing from an amazing person. But also it was incredible because I remember once my brother, Adam Farmerie, who is an architect who designs restaurants all around the world, he's like, hey, I got a call from Michael Batterberry. And I was like, what'd you talk about? He's like, almost everything under the sun. And it was amazing because I think that what Michael brought the food industry is culture. And it's not a food culture, but I think, he knew a lot about many, many subjects. He was a well-traveled person. He was a very animated, amazing person. And I think that what he brought food took it out of standing in a kitchen, cooking over a stove and feeding people. I think that he brought it to, it's not about what's happening today, it's about what's happening tomorrow. It's about what's happening in the future, and how can you act on that? And I think that he also brought, for me, an amazing view of almost a mentorship and how you treat people and how you can educate other people that can affect change in the future. So it wasn't about cooking this piece of fish for this table. It was about what's the big picture and who are these people working for you and what are they going to then bring into the world as well. And I thought that was pretty amazing, and I think that I'm a better person for it, and I think that I have more of a focus on education, and I hope that the people that work for me can see the vision that Michael brought me. And eventually I did start to get my message out, and I have been writing. And the one thing that I regret is that Michael wasn't around to see a piece that I wrote for Food Arts that accidentally got the cover.
Hold the cover up. So
It was great getting the call from Food Arts and asking me for my opinion and asking me to write something. And it's almost like you could hear a whisper saying, "Write more." I was like, oh my God, okay, yes. Write more. And I was like, yes. And I think that he had a message, but also his message was connecting like-minded people. And I think the big message that all of us have is that he was a great person at finding like-minded people who want to do great things and helping them do it. And I think that to find someone else that can do that is going to be very hard.
Tell them a bit about the story you wrote. This is very interesting about chefs cooking with blood, because it's sort of controversial, even though it's very traditional. And I think, we're trying to carry on that spirit of doing groundbreaking stories. Can you just quickly summarize it?
Sure. I was amazed that Food Arts wanted to write a story or run a story like this. I cook with blood a lot. And I shouldn't say that. That probably came out wrong. But I do enjoy looking at historical aspects of food and how those can then be translated into today and the future, and making sure that certain lines of what used to get cooked and how it was presented don't stop now. And how can we look at that 4 or 5% that goes down the drain, and how can we use that so nothing goes wasted? And I was very happy that I was asked to write something, but I think it just kept evolving and working with the people at Food Arts, which obviously are carrying on Michael's vision, and turning this into not just a small blip, but a real story, and then the cover, and then more information and a carry-on. And I think that's a great thing that they have the vision to run something that no other magazine would touch. Not only would they not touch it, they sure as hell would not put it on the cover. And I think that is vision, and that is what the magazine, for me, has always been about. I've read it almost since the beginning, and it's inspirational, and it makes you want to work harder, and it makes you want to aspire to something even better. And I think that there's not many magazines out there that do that. There's a lot of fluff, and there's a lot of things that I would never read, and there's a lot that's just pure kind of topical entertainment. And then there's this that's very different that I think can inspire and educate and change the face of the industry, which is no small matter.
Well, that's a big compliment. Yes.
I was going to say I had something else I was going to speak about if there was time.
Sure, there's time.
And it seems to be there is time. So one thing, and thank you all, you've been first rate, and I'm very moved because I know Michael would be, that he's made that difference to all of you. What I wanted to say is that something that I think would amuse or interest you is how we came to found both magazines, Food and Wine and Food Arts. When we founded Food and Wine, and I don't know, some of you look much too young to remember, but some people here might. Back in the 1970s, there was just one really food magazine, and it was Gourmet. And Gourmet was a great magazine, but it was a ladies' magazine, definitely. And we realized that during the 70s, there was a huge change taking place in the United States. And sort of the major factor in that was that suddenly men were as interested in food as women, and also as interested in how it's cooked. Not just men who are professional chefs, but men at home, wandering into the kitchen, wanting to, very often more interested than their wives were in actually producing food or cooking even for the family. And we realized this what was taking place, but it wasn't in any way reflected in any of the publications, or let's say in the one leading publication, which was Gourmet. So we decided we would create, we had been asked by people who are in the advertising business to try to put together a food magazine, and we realized that there was this huge change, and we wanted to create a food magazine that would be as interesting for men as for women. And it had to be conceived very differently from Gourmet, which was, as I say, a great magazine, but we realized if you're going to have a picture of a lemon dessert, you can't have it sitting there with a little lace napkin, a little glass, and that if you had a magazine with that sort of visuals, no man would want to have it in his briefcase. So we realized it had to be conceived totally differently, and the people who were cooking in the magazine had to be men as well as women, but also men who were cooking at home. And so we conceived of Food and Wine, and in Food and Wine, if we had a lemon dessert, we had a picture of 1,000 lemons going off into the distance, and then there would be a sunrise with a lemon dessert. And it was a totally, we made food more abstract and more universal than just what the little lady does in the kitchen. And we were, how can I say, rewarded because one of our backers was Playboy magazine, and which sounds unusual, but they realized that a lot of their readers would be interested in food, and they wanted to diversify, and so they were one of the original, people don't know that, original backers of Food and Wine, which was ultimately bought by American Express, but it was sold by our partners, ourselves, and
But when people bought Food and Wine, they could say, I bought it for the articles and mean it.
Well, exactly.
I just had to
Didn't
get
it
that.
start as an insert in Playboy and it got stolen or something?
No. That was a very funny story. One of our promotions was an insert in Playboy, and we had the insert published as a little magazine on its own. It was, in fact, a dummy magazine for Food and Wine, and it was this dummy, and it had a lot of empty pages and some printed pages in the front. But it went out in a box that was printed, on which was printed Playboy magazine, because they had printed it up for us. And we were having a big party for the new advertisers in the Four Seasons restaurant. It was our great thing, and we were going to pass out this dummy. And the dummy didn't arrive, and we couldn't figure out where it was, but it was the heart of the whole party, and we couldn't entertain all the advertisers and not have a dummy to show them. We didn't know. And we started getting in touch. I was sort of desperately on the phone while Michael was greeting people, trying to find out what happened with the shipment. Well, what had happened was, because it was a box marked Playboy, it had been stolen. There was a group of people who were stealing magazines in bulk and selling them. And what happened was, I'm sorry to say, the trucker took them home, opened the box while we were having the party, and oh my God, suddenly realized he had something that was not going to be of any use whatsoever to the readers of Playboy. And so suddenly, at the end of the party, the box miraculously turned up. We didn't ask any questions of where it had been, but that was part of it. But we did, in fact, Playboy was one of the backers of the magazine, but it showed how we realized how the whole audience was changing. And what was fascinating was, after our first year of publication, we did some demographics, and we discovered that half our readers indeed were men and half were women, which is fascinating. In fact, it was exactly the break of the population of the United States, because we're 51% women and 49% men, and the magazine was 51% women and 49% men. But what was fascinating was that the average age of our female readers was 42, which was exactly the same as Gourmet. But the average age of our male readers was 30, which meant that for every 40-year-old there was a kid in college who had taken the magazine. And so it just showed what tremendous changes were going on. And I want to say also, we were very lucky in capturing another change with founding Food Arts, because we founded Food Arts in 1988, and after we and our partners had sold Food and Wine, we always assumed that there was a magazine for restaurateurs. And many of our readers who were restaurateurs contacted us and said, well, why don't you do a Food and Wine for us? And it didn't cross our mind that there wasn't a trade publication for the restaurant industry. But when we looked into the matter, we discovered that there were, in fact, trade publications, but they were all for the fast food industry. There was nothing for the table service restaurant industry, which at that point was much smaller in terms of dollar volume than it is today. And the industry really, we founded the magazine in '88, and the industry really grew by leaps and bounds after 1988 into the 90s and into the 21st century. It was just an exponential growth. And I think many of us remember, I remember going in '88, going to Chicago, and there were a handful of really good restaurants that everybody went to if they were going to Chicago. And that was all, maybe at the most 10 or 12. Now there's a Zagat of Chicago with 350, and every one of them as good as the 10 or 12 that were really making, were important in 1988. So we were actually part of this huge growth as well. I think we were really just lucky in that we did things at the very moment when they were most important.
I think you both were able to see it. I remember that event that I went to that you staged for the first anniversary of Food and Wine, because if I remember, that was the first time that anybody had really acknowledged the American chefs. And they staged this as kind of a competition between American chefs and European chefs. Paul Prudhomme and Alice Waters were the American chefs, and I don't quite remember the French and the Italian people who came, but they were sort of set up as the American chef is just as good as these guys.
It had to be proven in those days.
Yeah, it had to be proven because everybody, the French chef was the thing.
Yes, exactly. By Americans' idea of a chef was by definition French. Or
that must have been like '86 or something, wasn't it?
Well, it was earlier. It was 78. 79.
That early? Oh, my
Yeah.
God.
We founded Food and Wine in 1978.
Wow.
And this was our first anniversary in 1979. And it's true that we thought it was pretty revolutionary that we invited American chefs, and Alice Waters was not known outside of California, and Paul Prudhomme was not known outside of New Orleans. And
you know, they arrived with their ingredients.
Ingredients.
Paul had these live crawfish,
yes.
and Alice had lettuce still growing in the flats. I remember this woman sitting next to me as the rich people came to she said, "Oh, this is the best salad I've ever had." You know, it was picked like 2 seconds before it was served. But in those days, that was very unusual.
Oh, it not only was it unusual, it was unheard of. Oh, the other thing, Alice just horrified and amazed everybody by serving a big head of garlic. You know, roasted garlic. Nobody had garlic that way. Garlic was something you snicked in without telling anybody, a little bit here or there. And the idea of a whole head of garlic, you know, that you just ate straight away as if it was a vegetable. People were horrified, and they'd sort of pick at it and think, was it going to do something to them? But that event, we had a whole week of lunches and dinners at Tavern on the Green, and that event was the start of a whole lot of things. But also, as it happened, and this was sheer chance, the Washington Post was having their very first food pages, because it hadn't crossed the mind of the major newspapers in the country that food pages was something you would want to have, other than the New York Times, which actually in those days didn't even have a separate food section of food pages, but there was a food section in the Times. And there wasn't a food section in the Washington Post or any of the other major newspapers, but they were just starting, and what they did was they put Alice Waters and Paul Prudhomme on the front page because it was such news that people were actually writing about American chefs. And it's amazing the changes that have happened. Certainly in our lifetimes, but many of you are young, and not in your lifetime, but things happened really quite recently.
Proud of your profession? Do you feel?
Oh, completely. I would remember it wasn't long ago where if somebody said to their parents,
yes,
or one parent would say to another, "Oh, my daughter's going to marry a chef," and the other parent would say, "I'm so sorry." Yeah, it's changed. It's just a complete revolution for us. And you know, the interesting thing is when you look at food as a single subject, it has more to do with, you know, cultural health, societal health, human health, environmental health. As a single subject, it just has such tremendous impact. And just 20 years ago, the people that were really working hard feeding the rest of the world were really actually thought of as just common workers. And
Well, actually, the government
it's
actually
changed.
changed the classification.
Changed
They used
quite
to
a
be
bit,
called
yeah.
domestic workers.
Yes, until 1978, a chef was by definition, according to the U.S. government, a domestic servant.
right.
And
Really?
which is sort of a little, I'll just tell you 2 stories apropos of what you were just saying. Michael, every once in a while, Michael would get a call from a desperate friend of a parent or saying, you know, my son wants to be a chef. What should I do? And the first was he got a call from a friend who said, and this happened twice, my son's roommate at college wants to be a chef, and his father's all upset. And what should he do? And can this young man speak to you? So Michael said this, tell him to call up. The first one was a young man named Dan Barber, and he was right out of college, and he'd been ill, and but was feeling better, and wanted to be a chef. And his father, he told this to his father, who was a manufacturer. He was in the toy business, and his father had said, well, you know, I like reading books, but, you know, I don't feel I have to be a writer. Do you really feel just because you love food that you have to be a chef? And he said, yes, he did. So Michael, he became a protege of Michael's, Michael sent him off to the FCI, you know, in those days called the French Culinary Institute, and then he became a caterer, and his career took off. And then several years later, there was another call from another friend of ours who said, my son's roommate in college wants to be a chef, and his father's all upset, and what should he do? And that was David Chang, whose father had made a fortune in shops, in golf shops, and he was from Korea, and he had put his son through Harvard or Princeton, and David announced to his father that having this great Ivy League degree, he wanted to go to Japan to study noodles. And his father was completely hysterical. And we got the call because his roommate felt that maybe Michael would be able to help and maybe explain to his father that the world hadn't come to an end. But he did indeed go and spend 2 years in Japan studying noodles, and the result is this huge, huge success. But that was sort of happened. It happened more often than one would expect, especially the noodle story.
That's a great story, it really is.
Yes.
I think it'd be great if we could take some questions from the audience while we still have a little time. And they've asked that you go to the side where there's a microphone because, oh, you go, the microphone will come to you? Okay.
Mobile mic.
Mobile mic. Does anybody have a question? Back in the back?
I was gonna ask her, what is the favorite dish that he actually cooks for her? That you like?
Favorite dish.
Michael's favorite dish.
Now, that's a very good question, and it's a very good example of what Michael was like, that I can't, although I was his wife for 42 years, I can't answer that. Because there were so many things he loved, and it would always be some new dish he discovered. He'd get all excited. And I'm trying to think. He had so many favorites. I wish I could name one for you. But, and he did like big dollops of caviar, if you could believe that. I think maybe his favorite thing was just to be given a pot of caviar and he'd sort of eat it. And I don't eat it at all, so he was always on his own.
Caviar's rather delicious.
Well, but you're
tasty stuff.
Exactly. It was a very good question, and I wish I could answer it.
I was gonna ask you another one. I was gonna ask, what dish do you prefer that he would cook for you?
Oh, I'm like my husband. It's just, there are so many dishes I love. I don't know where to begin. I'm trying to think. It all depends, and it's so, people often ask me, what is my favorite restaurant in New York? And they ask Michael that all the time. And the truth is, it all depends. There's so many great restaurants and so many great dishes. It all depends on what you feel like right now. For example, I was just at a place called Tertulia, which is a wonderful new Spanish restaurant, tapas bar, and it's fun, and you would enjoy it. And I was sort of amazed to find that I ordered their steak, which was prepared in a special way in their special oven and all. And I realized I just felt like some red meat. Now, you couldn't give me a steak today because I had this 2 days ago, and I won't feel like a steak for another month. But it all depends on what you happen to feel like right now. I think where restaurants and dishes are concerned, we're all very spoiled because there's such great variety available to all of us all the time.
Speaks to Michael's legacy that we have so many more choices and a better
Yes.
chance of finding a great meal on any given day today than we would have 20 years ago.
Oh, that's for sure. That's for sure.
I have a question that I'll just throw out to the whole panel. Anyone can answer. I was just reading Michael Pollan's article that was in the New York Times Magazine. I think it was last weekend or the weekend before. And I had never heard this before about how scientists are working on, I guess, of cloning animals for meat, because the cost of petroleum and the cost of grass and grain and everything going up, of creating sheep, I guess, in the incubator like they did in London years ago and things like this. And also the bioengineered foods, like the soybeans and the corn and all this stuff. Do you see that this is the future? That this is what's going to be in 50 years from now?
Interesting. Do I see it as a future? Do I see the need of it for the future? I guess I don't see the need for it. When I look at arguments about, cost to feed petroleum, transport costs as a justification for cloning, makes no sense to me, because once the animal is born, it needs to eat. For me, when I look at the way the system is engineered and the lack of support for things like fruits, vegetables, grains, foods that are incredibly delicious, foods that have sustained cultures and actually allowed civilization to happen. Meat was a very, very small quotient of that. Meat often was an animal that served another purpose during life, and when you very sadly were losing the service of that animal, the most sensible thing to do to forward your family's life or your community's life was to then turn that animal into food after it had done years of service. So meat was a very small part of the equation. So I would love to see a future with less meat. Getting back to kind of the ratio that we were at maybe 100 years ago, when we were a heck of a lot healthier. It really is 100 years ago and up until the last decade where we've had the greatest life expectancy. And that's when the majority of people were in the agricultural, hardworking endeavor. People were physically active, and they were really eating locally, organically, sustainably. Most of their food from plant sources, which was much more affordable than meat at that time. So now it's very, very skewed. When I look at the notion of GMO really is it's a money grab for development subsidies, and also to keep this system of cereal and oil crop and processed food at the forefront of our food culture. If we change our food culture to one that is more focused on fruits, vegetables, what is now called specialty crops, which receives no government subsidies of any kind, which is why it's more expensive in the grocery store than conventional crops. If we can get back to that form of agriculture, it creates more jobs, it's less expensive in the long run, because it really creates a need for you to recirculate currency within your area. There's plenty of land in the world to plant in agriculture. There's plenty of dormant land that's going arid right now because it's not being grazed by animals. I think simple changes in our food system can get us by for another 2 or 3 generations before we really have to worry about having enough humans to where we're going to run out of food. And right behind you is one of the greatest experts of all time on these subjects, Marion Burroughs, but Marion Nestle, and correct me if I'm wrong, Marion, but I think we produce somewhere around 4 to 6 pounds of food per every single human being living on the earth today, and the majority of it is either stored as a weapon in inventory or wasted, thrown away, because it doesn't get to an end user by the time that it spoils. So food production isn't a problem right now for us. Equity in distribution in equity, in tax law, and things like that. Those are the problem. I don't think we need GMOs to feed the world, or cloning. That's just my personal opinion.
Can I also just ask, what is your radio show on? What days and time?
My show is Sundays at 1 p.m., but all of the shows on heritageradionetwork.com are archived, and they are uploaded to iTunes. So if you go to iTunes, you can find any show you want with any host, and really there is a wealth of information there from young farmers, people in the seafood industry. I mean, I happen to be very interested in policy and some of the issues that you just brought up, GMO and cloning and things like that. Those are things I hope to actually explore more. But to just speak for a second about cloning, the other technology that is being developed around producing protein is literally growing meat as kind of like a chunk of meat in a petri dish. Seriously. I'm not kidding you. You've read about that, right, Michelle?
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing.
It's kind of a weird concept. Yeah, it's a very weird concept. But I suspect that in the end, if we're going to create meat, quote unquote, out of something, I think that will be the way we do it, because we won't be then required to husband the animals. The animals will not be needing food and water, because it will literally just be a protein product that grows in a jar. And then it'll be flavored. I mean, this very well could be the future of food. It will be flavored, because we will have 9 billion more people by 2050 than we have right now. And that's the thing right now that the UN is thinking about, and that people like Michelle are thinking about, and anybody who's interested in agriculture at all, whether it's for the conventional form of agriculture and this, by the way, is their battle cry is like, you sustainable people, you're all a bunch of earthy, crunchy hippies. You're never going to be able to feed the world. There's going to be 50 million more people, blah, blah, blah. And, we have to keep growing corn and soy, because otherwise it'll all break down and people will starve to death. And that's just simply not true. But the fact is that we do need, I think, we need to find a balance between the efficiencies that have been created by what we call commodity or conventional agriculture as we know it now, and the kind of sustainability that Gus Schumacher, that Michael Batterberry, Michel Nischan, and all of the other people, Oren Hesterman, all of the people who are working on what's called fair food. So, it's a difficult thing to find that balance, and it's great that more and more people are coming over to the side of sustainable food as opposed to the conventionally raised food, because there will be a need for, something that is meeting the two minds.
Did we have more questions? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think the stories were really inspiring and really gratified, and it's terrific what all of you are doing.
Thanks for the questions. Thank you. Excellent.